science and mystery, logic and intuition, diagnosis and transformation. Modern psychology gives us names for our problems: anxiety, trauma, identity. But the occult? The occult asks bigger, wider questions like, what is the soul? What are symbols really saying? And is your consciousness bigger than your brain? Today, psychology wants proof. The occult trusts experience. Psychology works with what's seen. The occult works with what's hidden. Psychology treats symptoms. The occult reveals meaning. But what if they're both trying to describe the same thing from opposite ends? There are truths, deep, ancient, unsettling truths that the modern mind tends to ignore, not because they aren't real, but because they're too real. They don't fit in lab reports. They show up in dreams, in synchronicities, in symbols you can't explain but still feel. These are the truths that don't just fix your mind. They awaken your soul, and in that waking up, your mind, in turn, transforms. As Carl Jung so poignantly said, the modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He thinks he can cut out mythological elements from his thinking, but he is wrong. Welcome to Mantis Library, where psychology meets the unknown. Let's begin. Let's be honest, most of us have felt something that can't be explained by a checklist or a brain scan. That quiet sadness you carry for no reason, the way a dream stays with you all day, or how a place you've never been can feel familiar. Moments like that feel deeper. But when we turn to modern psychology for answers, we're often told it's just our brain misfiring, or childhood conditioning, or some pattern of thought that needs rewiring. And that's helpful sometimes, sure, but it also feels like something's missing. Modern psychology tends to treat the soul like a metaphor, pretty, but not real. It sees people as brains with behavior patterns. Most therapy models today, like CBT, treat your problems like faulty code in a program. You just need to rewrite the code, fix the thinking errors, and you'll feel better. But feeling better isn't always the same as understanding why you feel the way you do. It's not the same as healing at the level where your sense of meaning lives. That deeper layer, the part that aches, longs, remembers, and dreams, is what we call the soul. James Hillman, an American psychologist regarded as one of the world's foremost post-Jungian thinkers, once said, "Soul is not a thing, but a perspective." What he meant was that soul isn't some magical glowing orb inside you. It's the part of you that turns events into experiences, that asks, what does this mean, rather than just, how do I fix it? It's the difference between surviving and actually living. The soul doesn't just want to function, it wants to feel. It wants beauty, purpose, depth, and that's not something you can capture with a brain scan. And Carl Jung saw this too. He didn't believe the soul was just metaphor. He saw it as the deep center of the psyche, the part of us that connects to the eternal, to archetypes, to the unconscious, and to the divine. He believed the soul speaks through symbols, images, and dreams. And he also believed that when we ignore the soul, we suffer in quiet ways, through depression, through anxiety, through that empty feeling of, I'm doing everything right, but nothing feels right. It's not just theory, either. People who've had near-death experiences often describe something profound, floating above their body, feeling a sense of peace, seeing light, or meeting a loving presence. And these reports come from all kinds of people, doctors, scientists, even those who didn't believe in anything spiritual. Many of them return completely changed. They talk about life differently. They care more about meaning and connection. Something in them woke up. And that experience doesn't sound like brain chemistry. It sounds like the soul. Jung also talked about the anima and animus, inner figures that guide us toward wholeness. You might see them in dreams or feel them as an invisible voice of wisdom. They're not literal ghosts. They're symbols of the soul's voice. The anima might show up as a wise woman in a dream, gently pointing towards something you've been ignoring. The animus might appear as a strong man urging you to act. These aren't just images, they're guides, and they often show up when you're at a crossroads in life. Mystical traditions across the world have always known this. In Kabbalah, the soul has layers, each connecting us to a different level of being. In Sufism, the soul is refined through love and longing. In Hinduism, the Atman, the soul, is the eternal self beneath all the masks we wear. None of these traditions see the soul as a fantasy. They see it as the most important part of who we are. And yet, in most therapy sessions today, the soul is never even mentioned. Why? Because it's not easy to measure. It doesn't show up on a brain scan. And in a world that worships science, if something can't be measured, it's not taken seriously. There's also a layer of fear. Psychologists don't want to be labeled as unscientific, so they avoid anything that sounds too spiritual, too mystical, too woo-woo. And by doing that, they might be cutting people off from the very thing that brings healing. Because real healing isn't just about fixing symptoms. It's about reconnecting with what makes us feel alive. It's about finding meaning in our pain. It's about understanding that the parts of us that feel crazy might actually be trying to say something important. Maybe your anxiety isn't just a chemical imbalance. It might be your soul's way of screaming, something is off. Maybe your depression isn't just low serotonin. It might be grief for a life that's not truly your calling. See, the soul doesn't speak in diagnoses. It speaks in longing, in images, in quiet truths. And once you start listening, everything begins to shift. Your problems don't just become things to manage. They become doors to transformation. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is my soul asking me to notice?" You begin to see your life not as a set of tasks to complete, but as a journey full of meaning, full of mystery, and yes, full of soul. That's the first truth modern psychology tends to ignore. The soul is real, not as an object, but as an experience, not something to believe in, but something to feel. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. You start to see it in everything, the way music moves you, the way a dream stays with you, the way a single moment can change your life forever. That's soul, and it's waiting for you to remember it. The second truth that modern psychology tends to brush aside is the power of symbols, not just as metaphors or personal associations, but as something deeper, older, and strangely alive. In most therapy settings today, symbols are usually seen as nothing more than projections of your own mind. You dream of a snake, and your therapist might say it represents fear or trauma. If you're into Freud, maybe it gets twisted into some repressed desire. Either way, the symbol is explained away as something you created, nothing more than a mental doodle from your subconscious. but that's only scratching the surface. Symbols aren't just little signs floating around your mind. They shape your reality, whether you're aware of it or not. Joseph Campbell, who spent his life studying myths and symbols across cultures, said, "A symbol, like a myth, is a product of the human spirit working as nature does, out of the unconscious." In other words, symbols don't come from your conscious brain. They come from something deeper, what Jung called the collective unconscious. They rise up like dreams, like instincts, carrying energy that doesn't just belong to you, but to humanity as a whole. This is why the same symbols appear in different parts of the world, across different times and cultures. The serpent, the hero, the mother, the underworld, they show up in Egyptian tombs, in Greek epics, in tribal rituals, and in your dreams last night. They're not coincidences. They're archetypes, universal patterns that live inside us, shaping how we see the world, how we relate to others, how we understand ourselves. Jung believed these symbols carry what he called psychic energy. They're not just pictures, they're forces. When they appear in dreams or rituals or even logos, they do something to us. They move us. They change us. Think about it. Why do certain symbols instantly trigger an emotion? Why does a cross evoke reverence or rebellion, depending on your background? Why does a red stop sign create instant caution, even when you're walking? Why does a flag make people cry or kill? These aren't just shapes. They're carriers of meaning. They hold power, not because we choose to give it to them, but because they tap into something ancient and collective. That's why ancient cultures were obsessed with symbols, not because they were primitive or superstitious, but because they understood how symbols worked on the psyche. Mandalas, sacred geometry, runes, hieroglyphs, they weren't just art, they were tools. They were used in rituals to shift consciousness, to align the individual with cosmic forces, to open doors to the unconscious. Even today, if you sit and meditate on a mandala or a yantra, something in you shifts. You don't need to believe in it. The symbol does the work. And it's not just ancient cultures. Modern society still uses symbols all the time. We just call it branding. Logos like Apple, Nike, or McDonald's aren't just cute designs. They trigger feelings, memories, and identities. You see a logo and you feel something. It can make you trust, crave, or act. Advertisers and political movements understand this very well. That's why flags, uniforms, and slogans are so powerful. They tap into the same symbolic force that ancient priests used, but now it's for selling sneakers or shaping beliefs. Even in science, we see hints of symbolic power. Look at the placebo effect. A sugar pill given with the right symbol, a white coat, a stethoscope, a confident tone of voice can cause real healing. That's not magic. That's the mind responding to symbols it associates with authority and healing, and in turn, it triggers the body's self-healing capacity. On the flip side, the nocebo effect shows how symbols can harm. A person told they have a deadly disease might physically decline, even if the diagnosis was wrong. The body listens to belief, and belief is shaped by symbols. Jung believed that to heal, we have to pay attention to the symbols that show up in our inner life. He called this active imagination, a practice of engaging with dream symbols, drawing them, dialoguing with them, letting them unfold. He believed symbols aren't static. They're alive. They have their own autonomy. A snake in one dream might be fear, in another it might be wisdom or rebirth. The symbol adapts to where you are in your journey, and it can guide you if you're willing to listen. But most therapists aren't trained in this, and many psychologists avoid symbolic language because it sounds too mystical, too vague, or too subjective. There's a fear of stepping into what's considered superstition, but in trying to sound rational, psychology sometimes misses the point. Not everything that matters can be measured. Some things, like dreams, myths, or sudden insights, speak in symbol, and if we don't know how to interpret them, we're missing out on a whole level of inner guidance. The strange thing is, people instinctively know symbols matter. Just look at tattoos. People ink symbols onto their skin not just for beauty, but to mark a turning point, a belief, a transformation. They wear crosses, moons, wolves, roses, not because they read it in a book, but because it meant something during a chapter of their life. That's symbolic power in action. That's how the unconscious leaves marks on the body. And what about dreams? People all over the world dream, regardless of culture. We dream of falling, flying, being chased, or meeting mysterious figures. Those images often don't make sense logically, but they sometimes feel important. They leave emotional residue. That's because symbols speak a language older than words. They bypass logic and go straight to the heart. So, if symbols are this powerful, why does modern psychology still hesitate? Part of it is fear of being seen as unscientific, of stepping outside the bounds of acceptable language, and part of it is control. If you admit that symbols have a life of their own, then you're not in charge anymore. Your rational mind has to admit there's a deeper intelligence at work. That can be scary, but it can also be freeing. Because once you start to trust the symbols that show up in your life, you start to notice guidance everywhere. The dreams you're having, maybe they're not random. That animal that keeps showing up in your feed, maybe it's not a coincidence. That song lyric that breaks your heart every time you hear it, maybe it's speaking to you. Life becomes more meaningful, not because you force meaning onto it, but because you see what's already there. Symbols don't fix everything. They're not a shortcut, but they are a compass. They point toward what your soul is trying to say, especially when you're lost. And in a world that's obsessed with facts and data, sometimes what we really need is a symbol that reminds us who we are. The third truth modern psychology continues to overlook is the idea that consciousness is non-local, that it doesn't begin and end with your brain. It might sound wild at first, but stay with me. We're conditioned to believe that our awareness, our thoughts, our sense of self, all of it, is generated by this 3-pound organ in our heads. That's the modern, neuroscience-driven model. Your brain fires neurons, releases chemicals, and voila, consciousness appears. But what if that's not the whole story? What if consciousness isn't locked inside your skull? What if it's more like a radio signal, and the brain is just the receiver? Marie-Louise von Franz, a close collaborator of Jung, once said, "Dreams and psychic images seem to possess a certain autonomy, as if they came from a place beyond our personal mind." That's not just poetic. Anyone who's ever had a dream that wasn't theirs, a scene, a person, a message that felt foreign but meaningful, knows what she's talking about. It's as if the dream doesn't belong to you. It came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, to pay you a visit and help you along your journey. Modern psychology, however, doesn't want to touch this. It sticks to what can be observed in a lab. Thoughts are electrical patterns, emotions are chemical, mental illness is a chemical imbalance. End of story. But that explanation starts to feel shaky when you look at experiences that don't fit neatly into that box. People having the same dream, intuitively knowing someone died miles away, seeing a future event in a vision or a dream. These are often brushed off as coincidence or delusion, but they happen a lot, and they've been reported in every culture over every century. Jung introduced the idea of the collective unconscious, a shared psychic layer that connects all human beings. Think of it like an invisible field, a kind of Wi-Fi for the soul. It's where symbols, archetypes, and even emotions are shared, whether or not we realize it. This collective layer is why someone in Asia and someone in Africa might dream of the same archetypal image, even if they've never met and live completely different lives. It's not about cultural influence. It's about a shared psychic reality that exists beyond the brain. And this idea is gaining traction in science too. Quantum physicists like John von Neumann and Roger Penrose have proposed that consciousness may not be a byproduct of the brain, but a fundamental part of the universe. Think about that for a second. What if your consciousness isn't something the brain creates, but something the brain tunes into? Like a TV receiving a broadcast. Break the TV and the show disappears, but the signal is still there, waiting for another receiver. You don't have to go full sci-fi to see signs of this. Look at the CIA's remote viewing experiments in the 70s and 80s. Real government-funded research into whether people could see distant places or events without physical access. Sounds far-fetched, right? But the results were surprisingly accurate, enough that the military used it for intelligence. These weren't just spiritual hippies making things up. This was serious data suggesting that the mind isn't stuck in the body. Then there's the phenomenon of shared death experiences. These are moments when multiple people, often family members or caretakers, report seeing the same visions as a person is dying, visions of light loved ones waiting, or the soul leaving the body. This phenomenon happens across age groups, belief systems, and continents, and it points to something collective happening in those final moments. Something modern psychology can't explain with neurons or synapses. Psychedelic research adds yet another layer. People under the influence of DMT or psilocybin often report meeting entities, beings that seem intelligent, aware, and not part of their imagination. These experiences are so consistent, so detailed, that even hard-nosed scientists have started to wonder if these aren't just hallucinations, but actual encounters in a different layer of consciousness, a realm beyond the self, a realm beyond the brain. Jung would have nodded along to all this. He saw the psyche as far more vast than the ego. He believed the unconscious extended beyond the personal, touching something universal, something sacred. When you access this space through dreams, altered states, or deep introspection, you don't just feel different. You're touching something real, something older than you, something that sees you, knows you, and speaks in a language you forgot you understood. So why does mainstream psychology keep ignoring this? Again, part of it is fear. If you start admitting that consciousness might exist outside the brain, the whole foundation of neuroscience starts to wobble. Therapists might start to look more like shamans. The boundaries between science and spirituality blur. That's uncomfortable for a field that spent a century trying to sound respectable. There's also a taboo around anything that smells like the paranormal. You bring up telepathy in a psychology department, and people start backing away slowly. But the deeper issue is that we've become obsessed with what can be measured. And consciousness, by its very nature, doesn't fit inside a measuring cup. You can't slice it, scan it, or trap it in a lab. You can only experience it, and that's what makes it real. Just because we can't explain something yet doesn't mean it isn't happening, and dismissing it doesn't make it go away. What if psychology finally admitted what ancient traditions have always known? That your mind isn't just yours, that your thoughts might echo with something larger, deeper, and collective. What if therapy wasn't just about fixing mental circuits, but about exploring other realms of being? What if we treated consciousness not as a glitch of biology, but as a mystery worth honoring? That changes everything. It changes how we heal. It changes how we see death. It changes how we understand meaning, intuition, love, and even suffering. Because if consciousness isn't local, if it's not trapped in your skull, then you're not alone. You're not just a brain. You're connected to others, to archetypes, to the soul of the world. And that's the third occult truth psychology can't explain, but maybe someday it will have the courage to try. And if you like this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious, stay mindful, and never stop exploring. We'll see you again in Mantis Library.